The honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, now that Bill C-70 is back in the House for third reading, I'd like to take this opportunity to outline the long journey it took to get to this point. In
2018, the director of CSIS, David Vigneault, informed the government of threats presented by the People's Republic of China. That year, he warned the Prime Minister that threat activities and foreign interference from the PRC represented an existential threat to Parliament and elections.
In 2018, the government was advised that the measures then in place were not sufficient to counter these threats to Parliament and to our elections. We know that because that was the second finding of fact on page 73 of the NSICOP report. Also back in 2018, national security agencies advised the government to introduce a range of measures to counter these threats, including new legislation. Madam Speaker, it is also notable that in 2018, the CSIS director also advised the government of another threat from the PRC, the threat of espionage. We know that because for the first time ever, the director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service gave a public speech in December 2018 of that year. In that speech, he warned of serious threats from the PRC closely related to foreign interference, that of espionage. These threats came in the form of espionage targeting Canadian companies and Canadian universities in the 5 sensitive areas he outlined at that time: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 5G telecommunications technology, biopharma, and clean tech. Subsequently, in 2019, the clerk of the Privy Council sought the Prime Minister's approval for an action plan to protect Parliament and our elections. The Prime Minister did not approve that plan. Again, a year later, in December 2020, the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister sought the Prime Minister's approval again for that action plan to protect Parliament and our elections. Again, the Prime Minister did not approve the plan. Again, Madam Speaker, for the third time in February 2022, the National Security and Intelligence Advisor resurrected this initiative, and again, the Prime Minister did not approve an action plan. In all 3 occasions over several years, the Prime Minister did not approve actions that would have protected Parliament and our elections. In November of 2020, November 18th of 2020 to be precise, Madam Speaker, the House adopted a motion calling on the government to produce a robust plan to counter foreign interference threat activities here on Canadian soil. Despite all of this advice, despite the call of this House of Commons to the government to enact a robust plan to counter foreign interference, to take additional measures to protect Canadian democracy, little was done. And then, because the Prime Minister did not approve actions to protect Parliament and our elections, because the government failed to heed the call of this House in the motion adopted on November 18th, 2020, foreign interference threats increased from 2018 to present. As Justice Hogue said in her initial report of May 3rd, the risk from the impacts of foreign interference will only increase as long as, quote, sufficient protective measures to guard against it, end quote, are not taken. Then, subsequent to all of this, in the fall of 2022, explosive media reports about foreign interference threats broke. These reports raised questions about what the Prime Minister knew and when he knew it, and why he did not act on the intelligence and the advice he was given by the senior civil service. Further explosive revelations in the subsequent months followed in the media. Finally, on March 6th of last year, the government promised to take a look at introducing measures in law to counter these threats.
It took years for the government to take into account the advice from CSIS and from senior officials in reports from time to time. It took years for the government to table legislation. Finally, after a number of encouragements and a lot of controversy and a lot of work by so many people, the government finally reluctantly tabled Bill C-70.
To today, Madam Speaker, debate on Bill C-70 at third reading. Bill C-70 is a much-needed response to the existential threat to our democracy from foreign interference. It will modernize the CSIS Act, allowing CSIS to better obtain preservation and production orders and better obtain national security warrants for information, records, or documents through a single attempt. It will better allow CSIS to collect, retain, and analyze data for intelligence purposes. It will allow CSIS to collect foreign intelligence, and it will allow CSIS to disclose classified information outside of the Government of Canada to provinces, municipalities, universities, companies, and individuals who are being targeted. It will create new criminal offenses for those who would engage in foreign interference here in Canada on behalf of a foreign state, ensuring that we better protect Canadians against these corrosive, clandestine, corrupting, and coercive activities, especially Canadians and diaspora communities who have suffered for so long in silence and in isolation. It will also make it easier to prosecute these offences by removing the requirement to prove harm to the interest of Canada when a Canadian is targeted by foreign interference. It will create a new criminal offence that will better protect essential infrastructure in Canada, including stiff penalties for those who would sabotage essential infrastructure on behalf of a foreign state or foreign government. It will amend the Canada Evidence Act and makes consequential amendments to other acts so that it will allow information relating to foreign affairs, national defence, or national security and federal court proceedings to be better handled. Finally, the bill establishes a Foreign Influence, Transparency and Accountability Act, which creates a Foreign Influence Registry and a new Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner. The new Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner would oversee a public registry containing information on individuals in Canada engaged in legitimate influence activities on behalf of a foreign principal. The bill was strengthened in committee, particularly with respect to the appointment of a commissioner. The commissioner will now be appointed by the Governor and Council after consultation with leaders in the House of Commons and in the Senate, and after a resolution of the House of Commons and a resolution of the Senate is adopted. This will ensure, Madam Speaker, that while the Commissioner is situated within the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, within the machinery of government, that the Commissioner will have a degree of independence to manage and interpret the Act, to issue notices of compliance, to issue administrative monetary penalties, and to refer matters to law enforcement for criminal prosecution.
It took the government years to follow the advice from CSIS and senior officials, and it took many reports. It took years for the government to come up with legislation. Finally, after being encouraged many times and after a lot of controversy and so much work by so many people, the government reluctantly tabled this bill.
The essence, Madam Speaker. We must ensure that our democratic institutions and elections are protected from the threats of foreign interference. Inaction and delay cannot continue. As Justice Ogue noted in her initial report, the risk of the impacts from foreign interference will only increase as long as sufficient protective measures to guard against it are not taken. She also concluded that foreign interference in the 2019 and 2021 general elections undermined public confidence in Canadian democracy. As the general election draws closer, time is running out to strengthen the confidence Canadians have in our elections. Time is running out to combat the rising threat of foreign interference. Canadians need to be able to go to the polls in the next election confident in the integrity not only of the overall outcome of our elections, but in the integrity of each of the elections that take place in each of the 338 electoral districts in Canada. Madam Speaker, this bill must pass, and I encourage all my parliamentary colleagues in this place and in the other to support this bill and to see its adoption into law before we adjourn for the summer.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would like to acknowledge and thank my honourable colleague for his work on this legislation. I know he worked with the Minister as well, and I wanted to ask him, he mentioned in his speech about some of the amendments at committee, in particular changes with the appointment of the Commissioner, something we supported as well. Madam Speaker, could he speak why this is so crucial to this process and why committee moved forward with that amendment?
The Honourable Member for Wellington Halton Hills.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague for that question. She points out amendments that were made to the bill that would see the Commissioner not only appointed after consultations with the leaders in the House of Commons and Senate, but also after resolutions adopted by the House and the Senate. And I think that strengthens the independence of the Commissioner while also ensuring that the Commissioner is situated within the machinery of government, within the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. I think that that is an incredibly important balance to strike, which I think the committee did strike during its study of the bill. Because we have heard for so many years from so many experts, Madam Speaker, that there are too many silos within the national security apparatus of the Government of Canada. So this ensures sufficient independence to issue notices of compliance, to levy administrative monetary penalties, to refer matters for criminal prosecution to police of jurisdiction, while at the same time ensuring that the Commissioner is in the bureaucracy communicating with all parts of the national security system so that she can enforce this foreign influence transparency registry.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable.
The Honourable Member for Rimouski, Neigette, Témiscouata, Basque. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. My question for my colleague is, why did the Conservative Party refuse to support the Bloc's amendments, including prevention, 3-year ban on people who've left their position working for foreign agents? And secondly, there was a person who cooperated with the Chinese Jean Charest, to name the person, the individual in question, who worked for Huawei. And that same individual was a leadership candidate for the Conservative Party. So he worked for and cooperated with the Chinese regime. So how can we trust the Conservative Party, who accepted and welcomed people who collaborated with the Chinese regime within their own party? Thanks for the question. First of all, we are against the amendments that have to do with the 3-year ban, because this bill applies to all countries in the world. So there may be consequences for members who leave this place and go to work for organizations that are headquartered in our allies, that may work on promoting democracy or promoting Canada, and so on. So that's my first answer. Secondly, and I'm quoting from the report says there are 2 instances where officials from the PRC interfered with the Conservative leadership race, but we have no other information about the characteristics of foreign interference, and that's why we asked for more information in order to establish. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt to give time for another question.
Pat Langford, a brief question, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his intervention. Part 4 of this bill, which sets up the public registry, one of the key features of the registry is that it is country agnostic. So in other words, Madam Speaker, Canadians will be able to see how all countries' foreign principals are trying to exert influence in Canada, not only our adversaries, but also our friends and allies. Could my honourable colleague just comment on that feature of the registry, the fact that it is country agnostic, and how that lends itself to accountability and transparency for Canadians to see?
Brief answer, the honour for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Thank my honourable colleague for the question. It requires people who are conducting legitimate influence activities on behalf of a foreign government or an entity associated with that foreign government to register. It provides a deterrent for those who would not register and who would conduct illegitimate, coercive, clandestine, and corrupt foreign interference activities in Canada. And so I think it strikes a balance, and I think it will be a useful tool to strengthen Parliament and to strengthen our general elections.